The wind was sharp across the plains that morning, the kind that burned the cheeks and carried secrets between towns. Mary stood behind the crooked fence of her mother's yard, her hands trembling against her belly. It was the only part of her body she could still feel warmth in. The rest, her heart, her face, her soul, had gone numb the night her mother found out. Pregnant, the word hissed out of her mother's mouth like poison. The neighbors had heard. The preacher's wife had seen. There was no hiding a belly that grew faster than the girl's courage. Her mother's eyes never softened again after that. Now, a week later, a wagon creaked up the dirt road, drawn by 2 mules and shadowed by a man large enough to fill the horizon. The man stepped down, slow and heavy. He wasn't old, but weather and work had carved his face deep. His shoulders looked carved from oak, his hands large enough to break a man in half, or cradle a life if he chose. He didn't say much, only nodded once to Mary's mother, who was already fussing over the rope that tied a cow to the back of the wagon. "Strong milk," the mother said, her voice high, trying to sound proud. "She'll feed your men good." The cowboy's eyes slid to Mary, and he didn't blink. He looked at her the way storms look at the earth, studying where to strike. Mary felt her shame burn through her. She wanted to hide behind her hair, behind her sighs, behind her own breathing. But the man didn't look disgusted. Just quiet, measuring. "Get in," her mother said, not looking at her daughter. "It's done." Mary didn't cry then. She walked toward the wagon, her feet heavy, her whole body shuddering under the weight of the life inside her and the one she was leaving behind. The road stretched wide, and the cowboy said nothing for a long time. The silence was so thick, Mary thought it would swallow her whole. Every bump in the road made her flinch. When the wagon stopped by a stream for water, she stayed still. "You eat?" he asked finally, voice like gravel rolling slow. She shook her head. "Then eat." He handed her bread, rough and still warm from some earlier fire. She hesitated, then took it. The man didn't look at her again. He just filled his canteen and stared at the hills like he'd been alone too long. His name was Luke. He didn't tell her, but she heard it later from a neighbor who came to trade grain. Luke Turner, they called him, the giant cowboy from the northern range, a man who'd lost his wife and child to fever 3 winters past. He worked alone now, with only his horses for company. His house sat far beyond the edge of any road, built strong against the wind. The nights were cold and full of coyote cries. Mary slept in the loft, on old quilts that smelled of cedar and dust. Her body ached from work, but at least she wasn't being spat at or whispered about. The first few days, Luke kept his distance. He didn't ask about the baby, didn't ask about her past, didn't even ask her name until the 3rd evening when she burned the bread and cried quietly over the stove. He turned from where he was mending a saddle. "What's your name, girl?" "Mary," she whispered. He nodded once, went back to stitching. "All right then, Mary." And that was all. The days passed slow, marked by chores and silence. She fetched water, fed the chickens, washed his shirts by the creek. Her body felt heavy, slow. The baby kicked sometimes, reminding her she wasn't alone, no matter how much she wished she were. One night a storm rolled in, brutal and wild. The roof shook, and the barn door rattled loose. Luke went out into the rain without a word. Mary watched from the doorway, soaked to the bone, as he fought the wind to tie the door back down. When a board snapped and struck his shoulder, she ran out. Heart pounding, and grabbed the rope from his hands. "You'll get hurt," she shouted over the wind. "So'll you," he grunted. But she didn't stop. Together, they forced the door shut and latched it. When it was done, they stood there, dripping, chest to chest in the thunder's echo. For the first time, he looked at her, not like a stranger, not like a burden. Like a man seeing another soul fight beside him. "You got grit," he said, voice low. She looked down, tears mixing with the rain. "I ain't got much else." After that, things changed in small ways. He started talking more. Told her where the feed went, how to stack the wood so it stayed dry, how to ride the gentlest horse on the ranch. She listened, eager, afraid to lose the sound of his voice when he spoke to her. Sometimes she caught him glancing at her belly, not with judgment but something softer. The day he saw her struggling to carry a pail of water, he took it from her hands and said, "Don't. You'll spill before you get halfway." She wanted to tell him she could manage, that she'd managed everything alone for months. But something in the way he said it, quiet, protective, made her heart twist. Winter came early. The snow settled heavy on the roof, and the world turned white. One morning, she woke with pain tearing through her body. The baby was coming too soon. She screamed for him. He was there before she could finish the word, his big hands shaking as he knelt beside her. "I'll fetch the doctor," he said, but she grabbed his wrist. "No time," she gasped. He froze, panic flickering in his eyes, the kind of fear that makes even the strongest men helpless. But then he remembered something, someone. His lost wife. His lost child. He set his jaw, rolled up his sleeves, and stayed. It was hours before the crying came, soft, weak, but alive. Luke wrapped the baby in his coat and held her like she was made of glass. His eyes burned wet as he handed her to Mary. "She's small," he whispered. "She's perfect," Mary said, voice trembling. The baby's tiny fingers curled around Luke's thumb. Something broke in him then, some dam that had held back all his sorrow. Days turned into weeks. The child grew stronger, and Mary smiled more. The house felt warm, lived in, as if the ghosts had finally moved on. Luke built a cradle by hand, carved flowers into the sides. One evening, she found him outside, staring at the horizon. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No reason to now." She stood beside him, her shawl wrapped tight. "You didn't have to take me," she said. "Or the baby. I know what people think." He looked at her then, slow and steady. "Don't care what they think. World's cruel enough without folks adding more to it." Mary's throat ached. "You're kind, Luke." He smiled faintly. "Don't mistake quiet for kind, Mary. I just know what it feels like to lose everything." That night, as she rocked the baby to sleep, she thought about the word trade. Her mother had traded her for a cow, but maybe life had traded her something better in return. A place, a man who didn't speak love but showed it in every small, solid act. When Luke came in and stood beside her, watching the baby breathe, she whispered, "Do you think she'll have a better life here?" He nodded. "She already does." The fire crackled between them. The wind outside had softened. For the first time since the shame, since the pain, since the trade, Mary felt something grow inside her chest, something that wasn't fear or sorrow. It was belonging. Mary woke before dawn most mornings now, long before the first light touched the hills. The baby's soft cries pulled her from sleep, and though her body still ached from the birth, she didn't mind. The small bundle of life in her arms had become her reason to rise, to move, to breathe. She named her Clara, though she hadn't told Luke yet. The name had come to her in a dream, gentle and bright, like sunlight through snow. She wrapped the baby close and went down to stir the fire. The cabin was always cold in the mornings, the air sharp and quiet except for the creak of the logs. She had learned how to coax the embers to life, how to move quietly so as not to wake Luke, who always slept light and rose early for the cattle. But some mornings, like this one, he was already gone. His boots were missing by the door, and the trail outside showed fresh prints leading toward the barn. Mary watched from the window as he moved among the horses, his massive form steady and sure. Even from this distance, she could see the way he touched the animals, firm, patient, kind. He didn't talk much, but his silence was never empty. It was full of things he didn't know how to say, and somehow, she had come to understand that. She poured hot water over the oats and waited for him to return. When he came in, his beard and coat dusted with frost, he paused in the doorway, removing his hat. His eyes went straight to the baby in her arms, then to her face. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning," she replied, offering a small smile. "I made breakfast." He nodded and sat at the table. She poured him coffee and watched him eat, her mind caught between gratitude and something quieter, something she didn't dare name. The world outside still whispered her shame, she knew it did, but in here, it felt far away. After a while, he spoke. "You decided on a name yet?" Mary froze, spoon halfway to her lips. She hadn't thought he'd ask. "Clara," she said softly. "It means bright." He looked up, meeting her eyes across the table. "Clara." He repeated it slowly, tasting the sound. "Fits her." Mary smiled, lowering her gaze. "Thank you." The baby stirred then, fussing against her shoulder. Luke reached out, hesitated, then gently took her. His big hands looked almost too large to hold something so small, but he did it carefully, his thumb brushing over the soft curve of Clara's cheek. "She's strong," he said, his voice low. "Got your eyes." She's got your calm, Mary murmured, watching him. He didn't respond, but his mouth twitched, almost into a smile. Days turned into weeks. Winter began to loosen its grip, and the snow melted into muddy trails that glistened under the sun. Mary grew stronger, her steps surer, her laughter less afraid to escape her throat. She sang sometimes while hanging laundry, old hymns her mother once loved before the bitterness took her heart. Luke would pause outside, listening, though he pretended not to. He fixed the roof when the thaw came, and she cooked for him, learning his quiet habits, how he liked his stew thick, his coffee black, his evenings still. He never raised his voice, never touched her without asking, never made her feel like a debt. And yet, something between them began to shift. It happened one night when the air outside smelled like rain. The baby was asleep, and Mary sat by the fire, mending one of Luke's shirts. The light flickered over her face, soft and gold. Luke sat nearby, carving a piece of wood in his hands, some small toy he was shaping for Clara. "You work too hard," she said quietly, eyes on her stitching. He looked up. "So do you. I've always had to." He nodded, his knife slowing. "That's plain." She didn't know what made her say it, but the words came out before she could stop them. "Do you ever think about your wife?" His hand stilled. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Every day. Not the way folks think, though. Not with tears. Just the small things. The way she'd hum when she cooked. Or how she always left the window open, no matter how cold." Mary listened, her chest tightening. "You loved her." He looked into the fire. "Yeah, and I lost her. But that don't mean life stops. Sometimes, it just changes shape." She swallowed, the thread trembling between her fingers. "And me? What shape am I?" He lifted his eyes to her then, steady and deep. "You're the part that started to make sense again." Her breath caught. The fire cracked, the baby sighed in her sleep upstairs, and the world outside was only wind and rain. She didn't answer him, but her hands shook as she finished the last stitch. After that night, they didn't speak of it again. But the space between them filled with something unspoken, something that made every glance last longer, every silence heavier. In the mornings, he sometimes brushed past her to reach for a cup, his hand grazing her shoulder. Neither of them pulled away. In the evenings, he'd hold Clara, and their fingers would touch when she took the baby back. It wasn't sudden, but slow, like thawing ice. One evening, Mary stood by the window, watching the sun fade behind the hills. Luke came up behind her, quiet as always. She felt the warmth of him before she heard his voice. "World looks different, don't it?" She nodded. "Feels different too." He hesitated. "You miss home." She turned to face him, eyes soft. "Home wasn't ever a place. Just a feeling. I think I found it here." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he reached out, his rough hand brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. His touch lingered, careful, asking. Her heart pounded, but she didn't step back. She looked up at him, tears stinging her eyes, not from fear, but from the strange tenderness that wrapped around her chest. "Luke," she whispered. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He just looked at her, his thumb resting against her skin. "You don't owe me anything, Mary. Not for the roof, not for the food, not for her. You stay because you want to, not because you have to." Her voice broke. "I know. And I do." Something inside him eased then, something that had been locked up for years. He let his hand fall away and nodded once, like that small exchange had meant more than either of them could say. Spring came early that year. The fields turned green, wildflowers grew along the fences, and the baby learned to laugh, soft, bubbling giggles that filled the cabin with light. Luke couldn't help but smile when he heard it. Mary spent her days outside now, planting herbs near the porch, teaching herself to milk the cow that had once been her trade. Sometimes she'd stop and look across the fields at Luke working the land, his shirt damp with sweat, his back strong and steady. She'd never known a man who moved with such quiet purpose. One afternoon, she brought him water. He straightened, wiping his brow, and took the jug from her. "Thank you," he said. "You work too hard," she teased. He grinned faintly. "I could say the same for you." She hesitated, then said softly, "You don't talk much, but when you do, it feels like you mean every word." He met her gaze, his voice low. "That's 'cause I don't waste 'em." The warmth in his eyes made her heart skip. She turned away before it showed on her face. That evening, as the sun fell and shadows stretched long, Mary sang to Clara by the fire. Luke sat in his chair, carving again, though this time he wasn't shaping wood, just holding it, watching her. Her voice was soft, like wind in grass. He closed his eyes, the sound pulling something deep out of him, something buried with his grief. When she finished, she looked up and caught him staring. "What is it?" she asked, half smiling. He shook his head. "You make the place feel alive again, Mary." Her breath hitched. "It was always alive, Luke. You just needed someone to hear it." He looked at her for a long time, then stood. "Good night," he said quietly, though his tone carried more than the word itself. After he went upstairs, Mary sat alone by the fire, her hand resting on the baby's blanket. Her heart felt full and heavy all at once. Summer rolled in with heat and color. The ranch bloomed, and Luke began taking Clara out with him sometimes in a sling he'd made from an old saddlecloth. Mary would watch from the porch as the big man walked across the grass with the tiny bundle against his chest. It was a sight that made her chest ache. One afternoon, he came back with wildflowers in his hat, placing them shyly on the table. "For the both of you," he said. She laughed softly, touched. "You're full of surprises, Luke Turner." He shrugged. "Don't tell anyone." The laughter faded, and silence settled between them again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, familiar. She stepped closer, fingertips brushing the flowers. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked down at her, then slowly reached out, his hand hovering near her face. When she didn't move away, he cupped her cheek, and she leaned into his palm like it was the most natural thing in the world. This time, he didn't stop. His lips met hers, soft and sure, tasting of earth and sun and all the words neither of them had said. When they pulled apart, she was trembling. "I didn't think." He hushed her gently. "Don't think. Just be." That night, she couldn't sleep. The memory of his touch lingered like warmth under her skin. She lay awake, listening to the sound of the wind through the trees, the creak of the old house, the steady rhythm of Clara's breathing. She felt safe, for the first time in her life, truly safe. The days that followed were quiet but full. Luke treated her no differently, except for the way his eyes lingered longer now, softer, deeper. She found herself humming as she worked, smiling without reason. The shame that had once haunted her seemed to fade with every sunrise. One evening, a rider came up the path, a man from town who knew Mary's mother. He brought news she didn't expect. Her mother had fallen ill, taken by fever. The cow she'd traded for her daughter was dead, and the neighbors had stopped coming by. Mary stood there, the baby in her arms, feeling nothing at first. Then, slowly, sorrow crept in. Not for what had been done, but for what had been lost between them, what had never been given. Luke said nothing, only stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Later that night, when she sat outside under the stars, he joined her. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I should be sadder, I think. But all I feel is peace. Like maybe she's finally at rest, and I can be too." He looked at her for a long time. "You're stronger than you know, Mary." She smiled faintly. "No, Luke. I just finally stopped being afraid." He reached over, taking her hand. "Then you're braver than anyone I've known." She squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. "You gave me that. You and her." Clara stirred then, and Luke looked down at the baby with something close to awe. "She's got your fire," he said. "She's got your heart," Mary replied softly. They sat in silence after that, the night stretching white around them. The air smelled of pine and rain, and the stars burned bright above the endless plains. Mary rested her head against his shoulder, and he didn't move away. For a long while, there were no words, only the steady thump of his heart beneath her ear, the sound of the wind whispering through the grass, and the faint, steady breathing of the child who had unknowingly healed them both.